involved in our most efficient program.
Well, good evening, and lovely to see you all here. And no, it's very exciting news about Jennifer. She will be great. But what I'm here to talk about is what's happening upstairs, which obviously isn't this. Just in case you're all anxious that you. So I just thought I'd explain a bit about how the show upstairs came to be and the thinking behind it a bit before talking about some of the actual works in it. As those of you who were around when we reopened will remember, we reopened with a show called A Museum for Myself with Peter Blake's collection. And that exhibition looked at the great pop artist Peter Blake's own private collection and the way in which his collection of elephants and pop memorabilia and folk art and puppets and stuffed animals and all kinds of other things fed into his own practice and his own artwork. And it seemed like a rather good idea as an opening show for the Holburne, because obviously we are built around an individual's collection and we tell stories in the museum through that collection. I mean, one of the frustrations about William Holburne is obviously that he didn't leave a diary and he didn't leave much in the way of letters, and really all he left us was his collection. And I think that the all in that sentence is slightly unfair. What he left us was his collection, but obviously through that collection we get a sense of an individual and a sense of a person. And we tell stories through that collection upstairs. Thinking about an artist and their collection obviously allows you to do that, and more. And think about how, not only what a collection tells you about an individual, but in terms of a creative individual, think about how a collection speaks to or influences or is influenced by, the collecting influenced by, what an artist makes or does. And so this sort of idea seemed like a very strong theme for the Holburne to explore going forward. But when we opened with Peter Blake, although I knew this was something that I wanted to do more of, the fact is I didn't know who to do it with, and because it's actually, and maybe not that surprisingly, quite difficult to find out what artists collect what, and then even more difficult to find an artist, of a sufficient stature who not only will let you into his studio or her studio, but also would be willing to lend their collection, and also actually lay themselves open to an extent, to a degree to which an endeavour of this sort obviously does. Because it is, if you like, opening the door to what is a private conversation to a degree. So with this in mind, at the on reopening, various people came to the museum, if you like, who hadn't come to the museum before. And among them was a chap who's actually coming to give a talk around about Julian Opie later this month or next month, who's a chap called Jonathan Watkins, who runs the Icon Gallery in Birmingham, which is a sort of modern art, contemporary art space, although they actually also do historic exhibitions. And he came and we had lunch or tea, I can't remember, and we chatted about this and that, and I talked about this idea of artists and their collections. And he said, oh, well, you do know, don't you, that Julian Opie has a collection of British 18th century portraits? And I said, no, I didn't. And then he said, and miniatures as well. Oh, and silhouettes. And I thought, well, I think we'd better get Julian Opie here then. And so Jonathan put me in touch with Julian, and I invited him down to come and have a look at us. And at the museum, saying, I think you would enjoy it. We've got lots of lovely things, and Jonathan, I didn't say at this point, and we want to get our hands on your collection. So Julian did come, and obviously, knowing what I know now, to a degree, this museum was sort of made for him. I mean, it has within it a lot of the things about which he is particularly enthusiastic. And actually, when he came down, I was working on the portrait sculpture exhibition. It wasn't up yet, and he was beginning to make sculpture, and so we found portrait sculpture. So we found ourselves with lots to talk about. And the conversation sort of went on to this idea. And it's an idea that he was unsurprisingly perhaps nervous about. I mean, his collection is his private collection. The reason to show you this one, for those of you who do recognise these people, is that they are all instantly recognisable, and but depicted with the minimum of movement at Keith Mechanic's likeness. He plays with what he's got in front of him. He moves things about, and he takes away and reduces, and then adds it up if he feels that the personality, the character, is being lost. So it is a mind and hand as much as machine going into this. It's not simply, if you like, tracing a photograph and reducing it there. And of course, since then, the late 90s, he's experimented with people as well as faces, and reducing them too to these sort of hieroglyphs. This is Maria, is what this is called, and there's a person there in that pose, in just that, you know, the particular shapes of the body and the legs and the arms and so on, but reduced to, I mean, this is obviously what we see on the loo door, telling us where to go. I mean, it's a language of signposts and hieroglyphs that he's playing with, but making them human rather than simply emblems. We talked, and he began to agree in principle, but, you know, from the Cornelius Johnson portrait that is upstairs. So, and this painting was the inspiration of that blue curtain. More obviously, Julian's landscapes, which you will have noticed do not feature upstairs, often make very, completely direct reference to Japanese prints. And again, I was keen to have some landscapes in the show, but Julian, contemporary artists are used to space around their works. He feels that it's fantastically crowded up in that exhibition gallery up there, and that and he didn't like the idea of combining landscape and portrait. We talked about colonising the Wirth Gallery for a smaller display of Japanese prints and landscape works, but we were already committed to various things happening in the Wirth Gallery, so that wasn't a goer. Although, of course, the next exhibition, but one, in the Wirth is going to be our Edouard Silhouettes show, and that was one of the reasons that those figures have appeared all around the cafe by Julian, because that will clearly be direct reference to that exhibition, which is a very, I think, very happy and neat coincidence. This portrait, again upstairs, this is what I was talking about in terms of work that relates rather directly to manga anime illustration, both in its shading but also in this particular cropping of the image. And so there could have been a different show and a rather perhaps more literal show. But I think one of the things that he and I were very keen to avoid was a sense of compare and contrast, which is the danger. And, you know, one of the anxieties that Julian had about this as a show, that people would go in And if one hung one, old work next to new work, Japanese print next to landscape, manga image next to a portrait like this, that it would look like we were suggesting an equivalence or a direct sort of copying, for want of a better word, that obviously isn't what either the creative process or the collecting impulse has been about. It's about shared enthusiasms and ideas rather than direct comparisons, and we didn't want to be too literal. Sorry, there's the silhouettes. In that book, this picture is one that he sort of lives with absolutely daily. I think it's in the kitchen. And it's Reynolds, and it is rather fantastic. But what they all share, I think, the portraits, if you sort of think of them as a group, is a very particular sense of presence and individuality, which I suppose, that's what portraits sort of set out to achieve. But I think these do all arrest you, and they all have arrested him. And essentially he buys what he likes, which is again one of the, the nice things about personal collection. Another anxiety, obviously, well, not obviously, maybe some people wouldn't have it, but that Julian certainly did have, was, would this look like him saying, look at me, and all the lovely things I own, and you don't, you. And again, actually, in his introduction, he has a very nice, I think, analogy or suggestion, which is that he, did find this difficult, that, these are expensive works of art that he's paying a lot of money for. But then he said, but if I thought about it in terms of swapping my art for the art of others, as you do, obviously contemporary artists do swap art with each other, and this, in a way, is Julian swapping art with Reynolds and Cornelius Johnson. And he also makes the point that, although in a sense you are owning these things, you've got them on long-term loan more accurately, that you're looking after them. Obviously not very well with all that going on, but you're looking after them for the time being. So this is a rather wonderful Reynolds, which has fantastic sort of bravura painted sort of coat and cravat. Again, this sort of Grand Tory, slightly, I presume, old Etonian, slightly annoying, fresh-faced British type on the Grand Tour by Nathaniel Dance. The wonderful Picanoi, very comparable to ours. I'd actually, at some point, like to just introduce them to each other. Maybe when he leaves, we could take them and just look at them next to each other, because I think it would be quite interesting to do so. A rather wonderful early Romney, and some of the and then this, I think, very beautiful Nattier. They are various, but as I say, they sort of the classical and sort of Rococo in this instance, but nothing that suggests great drama, which I think is interesting. They're reserved in some way, I think, all of them, as images. And including Cornelius Johnson, who is not Van Dyck, but is the other painter at the court of Charles I. And actually Karen Hearn is coming to give a talk about Cornelius Johnson, who is a fascinating figure, also later this month. The fact that he's not Van Dyck is, even Julian Opie, I don't think, would buy Van Dycks for his to hang in his living room. So there are clearly budgetary constraints at work here, and which is also, I think, one of the things that, or the type of paintings they are, is also one of the things that I think Julian relates to and engages with and writes about as well. That these are artists like Van Loo who are in the portrait making business, who are employing assistants to paint the drapery, who are, as in this instance, producing several versions of a single picture. And so, in lots of ways, that business of picture making relates very closely to the way that Julian also operates, that he produces editions of pictures, that he uses assistants to make elements of what he does, that he produces. Often he will make a portrait and then produce it in different media and sort of play with it in that way. And he also writes about these objects as sculpture, that these paintings as objects, the frame and the sense of the presence that they themselves have as objects, which is also something that this Maria, At Home with Maria, is rather astonishingly an inkjet print on canvas, but printed with ink that won't disappear, and at an astonishing finish, and then varnished, I think. And so really indistinguishable from paint, in as much as when Julian does actually paint, you can't see the, which he does, but you can't see the brush marks. I mean, he tries to make the paint as sort of insubstantial as possible. And then, of course, there are the videos. Now, I did try, but I'm no technical whiz kid, to get this moving in front of us as we were looking at it. This is, well, they're all more sophisticated than one might imagine. I mean, some of them are quite simple. I suppose the least sophisticated is his self-portrait, where he's breathing, and I think that's just a straightforward loop. Although, even as I say that, I suspect he's blinking randomly. She's a rather ferocious, Italian judge. Well, actually, I don't know that she is ferocious. Apparently, she's quite nice, really. But she looks quite scary. But as you know, upstairs, her earrings are swaying, and she blinks. But her earrings both sway at slightly different rates. And so if you get mesmerised by her earrings, you will notice that, sometimes they're swaying sort of together and then they go out of sync. And so they're on two separate sort of links, and then her blinks are randomly generated, I mean, within reason. So, I mean, I don't know how if you like, frequently she blinks on average. So it's not actually a loop. She's not doing the same thing constantly. They're clearly funny, these moving portraits, and sort of intended to be humorous. But although also slightly scary. This one of Julian's eldest daughter smiling is a different thing again. I mean, the smile in a portrait is obviously, it's one of those things that smiles are very rare, very, very rare in portraits. There is, of course, a famous one painted by Leonardo da Vinci, but of course that's not really a smile. It's a half smile with, the corners of the lips lost in shadow. And the difficulty with a smile, or indeed any facial expression, is that they're movements. And we all know that if we try and hold a smile, even as someone tries to, sort out their focus on the camera, it swiftly becomes a sort of desperate sort of grimace that doesn't look like a smile at all. And so the idea of a smiling portrait as an animation makes perfect sense. And this is, well, as Julian describes it, a smiling machine. I mean, she smiles and then she stops smiling and then she smiles again. But using this sort of shading, which, as I say, derives to quite a degree from Japanese animation. But And then we have this work on stone. This is a sketch of his wife bathing or coming out of the bath. And this sketch, though, is, I don't know if it's painted on, but it's made on marble, one of the most durable materials. And there's clearly a game being played here between the medium and what is being depicted. This very casual sort of moment captured in this very permanent material, while at the same time, obviously, marble is what so many bathrooms are made of. And so, the idea of the bath and marble is not, again, is something that Julian refers to. Mosaics is something that he started making relatively recently. And again, this sort of, it's clearly an ancient way of picture making. It depends upon and it insists upon a simplification of a kind that Julian was already playing with. But it also suggests the pixel and the LED light and the more contemporary modes of picture making that he's also been experimenting with. And it's not as simple as you would imagine. I mean, they're made by a mosaicist in Rome, but the way in which you arrange the tesserae within the sort of shapes of the colours is very critical. And here you'll see that the tesserae follow the lines rather than, it's not simply pixels that you're actually drawing with the little coloured stones as well. And so, yes, so the portraits in the show, Julian Opie's works, do try and suggest the different kinds of portraits that he makes, the different materials that he uses. And all of them, I hope, refer in some interesting way to the historical portrait tradition, without necessarily referring to particular works that he has in his collection. So this is a conversation between two traditions of portraiture, and I hope it is a conversation rather than a compare and contrast and which is better and all the rest of it. This little crouching Venus, obviously the same model, if you like, as our Susini upstairs, was the first little piece of classical sculpture that he bought. But then, inevitably, his interest in portraiture led him to portrait heads. These are much more difficult to buy. I mean, there's much less of it about, and there are all sorts of issues, obviously, with buying classical antiquities. This is a wonderful Roman head with this strange effect, which is actually the cheek protector of the helmet, but it makes him look almost like some reptilian, alien-like creature. It's a relief as well, so he's only got half his head. I mean, obviously quite high relief it would be, which is why it's shown sideways on in the piece. And this is one of the sculptures that in the show. There are two they're very odd things, I think. And they are, it was Julian experimenting really with, was the pictorial language that he'd arrived at translatable into sculpture, and if so, how might one do it? But the really odd thing about these sculptures is the way in which they're painted. The sculptures themselves try and reduce a likeness in a similar way to his flat pictures, but then he decides to paint them with shadows, which is obviously a deeply paradoxical thing to do on a three-dimensional object. And actually, if you come into the room upstairs and sort of turn and face the sculptures straight on and look at them, you can't actually tell whether they're sculptures or not. And they have this strange sort of, are they reliefs? Are they, what are they? And it is a very curious hybrid, I think, the way in which he's created these. And inevitably, and these are hand painted by. I mean, I was amazed to find Julian in his studio painting one of these. That he's there with his brushes. I just assumed artists like Julian Opie never lifted a paintbrush or hadn't done for years, but no, they are sort of hand painted by him, and he writes very nicely in the books of painted sculpture. This a rather unusual thing for him to have collected in the context of the rest of his collection, but a wooden painted head of the saint. And this wonderful sort of, someone's had a go at those eyes deliberately here. So the damage isn't all just wear and tear, I don't think, here. Someone's poked them out for some reason. But the making and the collecting seem, in the case of the portraits, to be very much about a conversation going on and a noticing of things. And I think that is what, well, I hope that's what this exhibition does, that it gets people looking and people thinking, which is all that an exhibition can do. Also, the other thing that exhibitions can do, the game I always play in an exhibition is deciding what I'm going to take away with me at the end of it. And I think in this one it would be this extraordinary Proudhon bust of Gluck, who, with this, he had, was it smallpox? I can't remember. Yeah, smallpox. So sort of pockmarked skin. And this furrowed brow, which then sort of astonishingly gets carried down into his corduroy jacket. But it's just a wonderful, wonderful thing, and a great sort of masterpiece of portrait sculpture. And so I hope there's something up there that you would like to take note of, but I hope you don't. And that's it from me. But if there are any questions, I'd be very happy to try and answer them. Yes. He lives in Islington, London. He was brought up in Oxford, but that's not where he was born, and I've forgotten actually where he was born. But he was a young boy, sort of teenager in Oxford. But he now lives in North London. Yes.
Julian tell you how he cut the edges of the images that are not the ones that are painted, the others, because they don't know what the material is, but what's all how do you cut?
I think that.
Laser?
Are they the vinyl ones, like This Is Maria? Yes. He does talk about that in here, but it's a technique, it's vinyl and it's cut, and it's the same technique as is used for big sort of signs and sides of lorries and things, I think. So I presume I don't know how it is cut, whether it is laser or not, but it's a sort of industrial, if you like, technique. Yes. I don't. Well, he's not sure. There are a number of famous Opies. Well, there are two famous Opies. One is the painter, and then the other is, and actually there's a family of painters in the 19th century. And then there are the famous Opies who. The law and language of school children, who did all that extraordinary work, sort of recording nursery rhymes. But his parents actually came from Australia, I think I'm right in saying. This is just me trying to remember what he's told me, but because I have asked him that question. Yes, maybe, I think is the answer, but not very closely. Very good. Well, thank you all for coming on such a lovely evening, and enjoy it upstairs if you haven't already been there. Thank you. I mustn't touch this after last time.